Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning, and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. I'm your moderator today, Karl Cassell, President CEO of Horizons, a family service alliance. Water is considered one of our most valuable resources, making up 70% of our bodies as well as the planet. And maintaining clean and healthy water should be every local municipality's greatest concern. There has been considerable debate during this last year about a peculiar crisis that has crippled a community and caused questions there as well as around the country. The Flint water crisis raised the speculation that local, state, and federal government has failed its tax-paying citizens, and possibly other water sources might be experiencing the same effects with the crumbling infrastructure. Today, we are going to discuss the responsibility and lessons of the Flint water crisis with three important and knowledgeable guests on this topic. To my immediate left, we have Marty St. Clair, Professor of Chemistry at Cole College. Good morning.
Good morning.
In the middle here, we have Pramod Dwivedi, Linn County Director of Public Health. Good morning.
Good morning.
And on the end, John North, Co-Executive Director of the Iowa Association of Water Agencies. Good morning.
Good morning.
And so we'll jump right into the topic. As this has been raging and people have discussed, charges have been brought up on a few of the city workers recently. But let's discuss first water in general. So the first question, describe the nature and scope of the drinking water challenges related to health issues in Flint.
You want to take that one, John?
Okay. Well, approximately 3 years ago, the city of Flint switched their water source from the Detroit municipal water system and started treating Flint River water. And unfortunately, the chemistry of the water was much more corrosive than the water that they were purchasing prior. And that caused a reaction out in the system where it literally cleaned out the distribution system and the protective layers that were there and provided a direct access to lead in the form that was in the lead service lines, lead that was in the brass fixtures to include faucets and so forth, as well as lead solder joints. With that direct exposure, it started leaching, and any lead that was pulled out of the system obviously went into the water, and some of it was consumed. And the dilemma is any lead at all is not a good thing. It's not a good health. It's definitely a negative health consideration. So.
Why is lead a health concern?
Well, I mean, lead is unnecessary, first of all, heavy metal. I mean, your body doesn't need it. So, and it's always harmful, especially among children because they are growing body, and if the lead is consumed, then they have, immediate health concerns, and also later in life. There is documented studies that have pointed out that they have cognitive impairment, behavioral issues later in life, but also it can cause problems among adults too. There are chronic diseases that can happen, but it's mostly for our kids. I mean, that's why every public health program in our country has lead poisoning prevention program. We here in Linn County have that program as well. So we try to protect our kids from getting lead poison, and most of the poisoning actually occurs through the lead paint in old homes. Water-related lead poisoning is not that common, but because of what he just described, the service line leached lead into the water system, and that's why. I mean, there was a lot of negligence and aloofness and criminal conduct, I would say, in case of Flint, because our job is really to protect public's health, and I think the orthophosphate, the element that's used to protect corrosiveness, not cause corrosion. I mean, that was unlawful. I mean, they should have included that chemical in the water system, but that was not done, and that caused massive problem. And it's just against the law, really, right? I mean, it's a safe drinking water law prescribed that it should be treated with orthophosphate, and that was not done. So I don't know. I mean, and then the other very, very important thing is that the community is 100,000 people, 57 African American, and half of the population is below poverty line. I mean, the median income in that place is $24,000, whereas in Michigan is about $50,000. So I mean, there are a whole host of stuff that needs to be looked. Why we failed as a society, and especially as a government servants. I mean, three levels of government, local, state, and federal, they all failed. So it has caused a lot of problems. And
anything you want to add to either
Well,
one of
I
those
think,
questions?
as you said, I mean, we've known that lead is a problem for a long time, and we've begun, we have addressed it in paint. We no longer sell paint with lead in it, and we're working on the old homes. I actually own an old home in Mount Vernon, and had both of my children tested by Lynn County Public Health because I was concerned about it. We've eliminated lead from our gasoline, which was another major source in urban areas. As both of these gentlemen have said, traditionally lead in drinking water has not been a major source, but in this particular case, it's become very evident that it is significant, and clearly we need to address it.
So are there any chemical alterations that can be created? And if not, how do we control this from happening again, or pollution just in general to the water?
Well, in this particular case, as they both alluded to, we can treat the water to reduce the corrosiveness and to form a protective coating inside the pipes. So for example, in Cedar Rapids, we add zinc orthophosphate, which is a chemical that will bind the lead, tie it up, keep it as a solid so it doesn't dissolve. And that was something which was not done when they switched the water sources. And it appears, the federal law says in a drinking water system over 100,000, you need to implement corrosion prevention, but it does cost money. And it appears that in this case, that was a primary issue, that they wanted to save money.
Let me ask just really quick, one follow-up question. Is there any thought that the zinc, say it again, the zinc?
Zinc orthophosphate.
Orthophosphate, is that the only way it can be treated? Is there any other chemicals? And does that zinc have any side effects at all either?
Not in the quantities that it's used. I mean, the water chemistry is quite complex. You can change the pH of the water and make it more basic, and that helps with corrosion, but sometimes that's not enough. You can add silicate. There are a variety of ways of doing it, but the phosphate is the one that seems to be most commonly used.
Phosphate can take multiple forms. Zinc orthophosphate is probably the most prevalent, or a lot of places use phosphoric acid to get the phosphate. It's, as Marty alluded to earlier, water chemistry is very complex. And I just go back to the situation in Flint. If I had to point my finger and what did you do wrong, I would suggest when you made the change, you didn't anticipate that there might be change in the water chemistry, and monitor it very closely and identify what is the best management strategy to minimize the potential for lead. Because I think most water professionals would recognize that when you change water sources or the chemistry, it's going to have a multitude of effects, and you have to make sure that you understand all of those effects.
And there was a big change between
Yes.
the two sources of water that they were using to the one that they began to use. So,
I mean, immediately after the new source, that was Flint River, the people started complaining about odor. They started complaining about smell and the rashes, mysterious disease among some people there. But nothing was immediately done or addressed. I mean, it took months and months.
And from my perspective, that should have been a warning sign. That
Absolutely.
there's something happening here, and we need to find out what is happening.
And if you look at the public statements, the state spokesperson for their Department of Environmental Quality was rather disdainful of public concerns, of outside academics that came in. There was clearly an issue of their attitude toward the public of Flint, I believe.
So Flint, Michigan City Utilities Manager was among the first to be criminally charged for his role in the water crisis that deprived the city of clean drinking water for about 2 years. Prosecutors say he altered a water quality report that could have raised red flags about the lead issues in Flint months before it became public. He's accused of neglect of duty and tampering with evidence. Both felonies could lead to jail time, prison time. Is he one of many, or should he be the one bearing sole responsibility as we talk about local, state, and federal level? If he doesn't have the authority to make those changes, doesn't the blame fall even above him as well?
Well, I don't know what the legal implications are. I'm not a lawyer. I think his particular actions point out that you can write a regulation, but people have to implement the regulation. And in his case, it was a question of, do you count certain samples or do you not count them?
Right, okay.
And I think there's always going to be some judgment calls, but I think the key and the thing that's going to take a lot of years, I think, to rebuild in Flint is whether the role of the regulatory authorities is to protect the citizens or is it to save money and, you know, because I think that trust is going to take a long time to rebuild. That seems to me to be the fundamental thing that's lost.
Going back, the question I would have is, did he willfully change records? There's one perspective that that's what he did, and there's another perspective that he may have been working with records that were essentially non-existent, thinking that this area that we're sampling or this particular house has a lead service line. In reality, it didn't. And the reason he didn't know is because their records were not complete or accurate. So it's a very gray area as far as what his direct involvement is. But having said that, if he willfully changed records or altered records of some sort, then yes, that's not professionally acceptable and obviously is against the law. So.
Right, and there is evidence now that he tampered with the evidence and tried to suppress that. Also, I think he is now cooperating with the federal investigators and helping them to identify other folks who may have been involved with this.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the health concerns of those individuals that live in that community. Talk about regaining the trust from your local government. It's going to cost them a considerable amount of money just to change their pipes and the water and the infrastructure in general. But the dollar amount that it's going to cost in hospital bills, missed work, students in class, we can't even begin to estimate that yet. What are some of the major health concerns as I read articles about people who know they're depressed, they don't want to leave the house, some of the mental and physical health aspects that they're going to deal with?
Well, I mean, it's far-reaching, and only time will tell. There are some studies already under progress, and at least 2 studies that were done previously, which really revealed the high level of lead in the drinking water there. I think there was one particular household where first time when they tested the water, it was 96 parts per billion, the level of lead in the water, and then second time it was 300 some parts per billion, then it rose to 12,000 parts per billion, and the requirement, the threshold is 15 parts per billion. So it's a really, we don't know I mean, there's not just lead. I mean, we also know there were Legionnaire's disease also. There were outbreaks and 10 people died. There were 87 cases. So there needs to be some more studies done in order to really to have a better assessment and impact of this exposure. But it's safe to say that, mental health issues are always going to be there with some of the folks, then horror stories that we have read. Chronic diseases, as I said before, among adults, kidney and heart disease, those types of events are going to continue to occur. I think there has to be some sort of I'm sure that Michigan state and federal government and local government are now much more engaged. But I think there has to be some sort of a concrete assurance from these three layers of government to the public that we are. And also the other important thing that we have to keep in mind is that these are the people who live on the margins of society. I mean, and the way we have ignored them, we didn't pay much attention to their issues. It was going on for over a year. As a government, I mean, government is really custodian, right? I mean, we provide a lot of help to our citizenry. And we have failed miserably in doing so. So I think there has to be some sort of soothing touch to make sure and assure public that we are there to assist them, help them.
To me, I think the most disturbing health impact is, as you mentioned earlier, the impact on children, on children whose brains are developing, whose nervous systems are developing. And that's the kind of thing that, even low-level exposure to lead, it has been shown in the past to have measurable impacts. And so I hope, and I think some of these programs are beginning to fall into place, but I really feel like there needs to be a program of identifying the children who have had the highest impacts and providing for them in the school environment, providing nutrition for them, providing long-term follow-up, because those are really the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable, and we really need to be paying attention to that, I believe.
I would also point out that depending on the source, one source would indicate that prior to this incident or series of incidents, that the baseline was like 2 to 4% of the children had elevated lead. And then afterwards, it went to 8%. And there was another source that would indicate it was like 5%, went to 10%. But regardless, both of them would agree that it essentially doubled. And that comes back to the original question of what was that contributor to that baseline prior to this? And again, my assumption is probably lead-based paint, lead-based paint, lead-based paint. So.
Let me bring it back closer to Iowa and where we are. Perry Beeman of the Des Moines Register reports that the Des Moines Water Works, the drinking water supplier for about 500,000 people in central Iowa, is operating the world's largest nitrate removal water treatment plant in an effort to provide clean water to its customers in the face of record-breaking levels of nitrate pollution pouring into the Raccoon and Des Moines rivers. The pollution is agricultural fertilizer, runoff, fire-hosed into the rivers by all the channelized creeks, drained former wetlands and tiled fields in the region. Do these have an effect on our natural habitats, and is there a risk of people drinking this water? And it might not be the lead levels in Flint, but is there a chance or a risk for citizens of Iowa to be poisoned as well?
I think we're talking about some very different issues than with nitrate. The acute risk, the short-term risk are quite minimal.
Okay.
The standard for drinking water is based on a condition, blue baby syndrome or methemoglobinemia. I'm very proud that I can say that, so I want to use that. But that's a condition that I don't believe there's been a case in Iowa for 30 or 40 years. It's fairly unusual, but that's what the health standard is based on. And you know, to the best of our knowledge, there are no long-term neurological effects. I mean, they're it's a very different beast. The concern is that excess nutrients make their way down to the Gulf, create hypoxia, an area of low oxygen, and that has been kind of the driver for the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy and those types of things. Now, the Des Moines Water Works is obligated to provide drinking water that meets the federal standard, and that's the basis of their argument, is that because of the nitrates in the river, they're finding it very difficult to meet that federal standard. But the health risk to humans are, the lead risk is several orders of magnitude, I think, more serious.
And my assumption, and again, I'm not a health expert, but the studies that I've seen would indicate that it's some of the trace compounds of nitrogen compounds reacting with disinfectants is probably the long-term or the bigger effect or greater threat, I should say, for water quality. And we're talking parts per trillion for some of these chemicals. So.
One thing that I forgot to mention is in Flint's case is trihalomethanes that was a byproduct of chlorine, perhaps, and that is known carcinogen. And again, it will take some time to assess its impact on the population there which were exposed to this.
And just a perfect illustration of the challenge of water chemistry and getting that optimal level. The chlorine levels were increased because the chlorine, the coliform bacteria, Legionella incidents they were seeing. So they increased the chlorine, which in turn probably exacerbated the oxidation of the lead. So it's just a vicious circle.
What are the precautions that Cedar Rapids can take to minimize their exposure to lead in drinking water?
Let me stress that Cedar Rapids treats their water with zinc orthophosphate. They monitor it on a regular basis. They do extensive monitoring of homes that are considered to be at high risk. Those samples are taken under the conditions that are most conducive for lead. Cedar Rapids, as far as I know, has been in full compliance for the last 10 plus years. So good news in that respect, and I'm fairly confident that Mary and Hiawatha have similar reports that they would be able to share. But for the citizens, regardless of where you live, if you're even not on a municipal water system, two things that you can do. First, flush your system, your water, before you take it for consumption or food preparation purposes. Flush the water until it gets as cold as it's going to get. That way you'll be very confident that you're not getting lead, or at least minimizing the potential that you might be getting lead. The other thing is, never ever use hot water for food preparation, and most especially for preparation of baby formula. Basic law of chemistry that I can remember from the good old days is the higher the temperature, the faster the reaction. So hot water will leach lead faster than cold water. So those two precautions are great, humongous steps in protecting yourself. So
I do think that it points out, the whole issue kind of does point out that we need to pay attention to our infrastructure. We had a period in the 70s and even into the 80s when the federal government was providing funds for infrastructure, for water treatment, for wastewater treatment. We don't want to spend money on infrastructure these days, and it points out, I think, we need to, that drinking water distribution, wastewater collection, those things, we don't see them every day, but we have to maintain them, we have to invest in them, we have to modernize them. To not do so is to invite, I think, things like this.
And you know, again, I would agree that City of Cedar Rapids water quality is at par, and is very good, and they comply with all the regulations, treat it very well. They have identified at least 50 households where there may be problem. And they actually collect the sample every quarter and test it very regularly, and there is no accidents in the drinking water of lead. So, yeah. and we work with them quite a bit. Like pregnant women, they also have, if they consume lead, there is a pregnancy-related issues. So in nutshell, I think our community is pretty well protected.
Okay. Well, we have just a couple short 3 minutes left. Just want to ask a quick question that I'm sure a lot of folks are thinking about, and we as a nation should be thinking about. How often does testing take place, and will it be stricter going forward for local municipalities?
Well, I suspect it will be. I believe there's a review committee right now looking at this federal rule to try to change it, to make it, to eliminate some of the, gray areas that have allowed things to slip through. So I would anticipate that relatively quickly we will see a new rule coming out that will be stricter as to how often and how samples are taken and how the tests are completed.
And that's really a very important point that we have to make that happen in terms of regulations, making them more rigid, because we are talking about children's health. I mean, that should be and must be our priority because of their development and then IQ problem, cognitive problems, behavioral problems later in life. Actually, there's a delayed puberty also. That's one of the. So I think this is an important step that federal government, state governments can take.
Any last comment?
I would stress, I know the folks at Cedar Rapids Water Department, safety, the health of the community is their primary concern. And that's true for 99.9% of the water professionals out there. Again, I just go back and stress water chemistry is a challenging issue. Ensuring the safety of that water is their primary concern. So.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, very, very much today. We've had a lively discussion this morning, and I hope you learned something learned a little something more about this topic and what it means to that community and also to our own. Our hearts and support go out to those American citizens in Flint that have had to adjust their lives to this tragedy. It's important that cities and states and of course our federal government take all the necessary precautions to minimize these tragedies in the future. Thank you for joining us today on Ethical Perspectives on the News, and hope you tune in again next week. Good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.